Look at her shoes. Are those actually orthopedic? My daughter-in-law, Sienna, whispered that into her champagne glass as I stood at the railing of my own yacht, Vance Steele's $40 million crowning jewel. We were supposed to be celebrating my retirement. Instead, she was dissecting me in front of the crew. She's finally senile enough to think this company still belongs to her, she sneered. My son Julian just stood there behind her in his dark sunglasses, laughing like it was the funniest joke he'd ever heard. Julian's laughter was the sharpest blade. Let's be honest, Mom, he added, clinking his glass against Sienna's red jumpsuit. You're a relic. You're just a signature on an insurance policy we've been waiting to collect on. The crew stood far back, blurring into the horizon as they ignored the smell of betrayal. Sienna didn't scream when she put her hands on my shoulders. She didn't blink. She just gave me a 30% exaggerated look of mockery and shoved. The sun was at its peak when the world went sideways. I wasn't admiring the stars. I was looking at the empire I'd built from the deck of my own yacht, Vance Steele's crowning jewel. 1 minute, I was a mother-in-law sharing a quiet word. The next, Sienna's hands were on my shoulders, and the midday sky was being swallowed by the Atlantic. She didn't scream. She didn't blink. She just watched me hit the water and walked back to the bar. As I hit the midday Atlantic, I saw the yacht's wake growing smaller, carrying away my life, my name, and a $50 million payout I wasn't supposed to survive. They thought I was drowning. They thought the Iron Queen was finally cold. But as the salt water filled my lungs, I wasn't praying. I was counting. 14 days. In exactly 14 days, they were going to walk back into my mansion to claim their inheritance. And I was going to be the ghost waiting in the dark to take it all back. Before I tell you how I crawled out of that ocean and into their nightmares, you need to understand one thing. This wasn't an accident. This was a hostile takeover. My name is Eleanor Vance, and I am the one who forged the steel they are trying to steal. Vance Steel wasn't built in a boardroom. It was forged in the heat of a blast furnace and the grit of South Boston scrapyards. I started with a single crane, in a belief that iron has a memory. It stays strong long after the people who poured it are gone. By the time I was 40, I had turned a graveyard of rusted beams into the primary skeletal structure of the city's skyline. My house on the coast was built with that same clinical precision. Marble floors that amplified every footstep and floor-to-ceiling windows designed to let the world see in while keeping the warmth out. I was the Iron Queen, and my court was a place where weakness was a foreign language I refused to speak. Then, there was Julian. My son was born in the spring of 1996, arriving like he was already apologizing for the space he took up. I tried to groom him to be my successor, the heir who would carry the Vance name with the same immovable weight I did. I sat him through 1,000-man layoffs and corporate mergers, hoping the steel would eventually rub off on him. But Julian was soft, a dreamer who looked at a girder and saw a sculpture instead of a structural necessity. He wanted a world where people were allowed to feel things, a sentimentality that I viewed as a structural flaw. When he brought Sienna home 3 years ago, I saw the shark behind the saintly smile immediately. She was polished, wearing a look of modest elegance that I knew was a costume designed to blend into my expensive wallpaper. She didn't just join our family, she studied it. She sat at our formal dinner tables, nodding politely, while her eyes cataloged our assets and mapped our vulnerabilities. She learned the Vance commandments: stay silent, stay strong, trust no one, and realized that if she followed the rules perfectly, she could eventually rewrite them. Julian saw a woman who finally understood the cold silence of his childhood. I saw a woman who was perfecting the art of being invisible until the moment was right to strike. I had spent decades watching everything, while appearing to see nothing, a survival skill I honed until it was second nature. I thought I was the predator in the room, but Sienna was the one who understood that even an empire built on steel has a breaking point. She didn't want to be part of the court, she wanted to be the one who cleared the throne. I had spent my life building a display case for my success, never realizing I was just building the stage for my own execution. The salt water was a heavy, suffocating weight, dragging at my limbs until my muscles turned to lead. I had survived the initial plunge, but the Atlantic is an indifferent executioner. For hours, I drifted in a void of gray swells and white foam, my white tweed jumpsuit becoming a sodden shroud that threatened to pull me into the abyss. I was Eleanor Vance, a woman who had commanded thousands, now reduced to a frantic heartbeat and a desperate prayer for a piece of floating debris. Just as the numbness began to turn into the final seductive sleep of the freezing, a rhythmic thrumming vibrated through the water. A hull, rusted and salt-stained, cut through the mist. "Over here." "Dad, look." The voice was young, frantic against the roar of the engine. A net didn't save me. It was a pair of calloused hands, strong and smelling of diesel and brine, that hauled me over the gunwale. I collapsed onto the deck of a trawler that's seen better decades, coughing up the Atlantic while a boy no older than 20, Arthur and his father Billy, wrapped me in a wool blanket that felt like sandpaper and heaven. His father, a man with a face like a weathered cliffside, didn't ask for my name or my stock portfolio. He just steered the boat toward the shore, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if he'd seen enough shipwrecks to know that the sea doesn't like to give back what it takes. They didn't take me to a hospital, which was the first of many miracles. They took me to their family inn, a sagging 2-story building tucked into a cove that looked like it had been forgotten by the modern world. Arthur's mother met us at the door with a bowl of soup and a silence that was more comforting than any boardroom platitude. I stayed in a room that smelled of cedar and old books, watching the news on a flickering television as the world learned of my tragic accident. It was there, staring at a grainy photo of my own face on the screen, that the reality of my situation crystallized. To the world I was a headline. To Vance Steele I was a vacancy. And to Sienna I was a successful kill. I realized then that I was a digital ghost, a woman whose life had been erased by a single shove. If I called the police or my lawyers, I would be stepping back into a trap I didn't yet understand. Sienna had the codes, the company, and my son. To dismantle her, I couldn't be Eleanor Vance, the CEO. I had to stay dead. I had to stay invisible until the iron was hot enough to strike. In that quiet room, with the sound of the surf mocking my previous life, I began to map out a revenge that would be as cold and enduring as the steel I had spent my life forging. The back office of the inn smelled of damp ledger paper and stale coffee, a cramped sanctuary where the only light came from a flickering fluorescent bulb and the hum of a prehistoric desktop computer. I sat in a chair that creaked under my weight, staring at a monitor that belonged in a museum. This was the bridge from which I would retake my empire. I wasn't a CEO here. I was a shadow in a white tweed jumpsuit, a ghost haunting the digital periphery of my own life. My hands, still stiff from the Atlantic's chill, hovered over the yellowed keyboard. I didn't go to the news sites or the Vance Steele homepage. I went to a server address, known only to 2 people in the world. I typed out a single encrypted line to Marcus, my head of internal security, and the only man in Boston who knew where the bodies were buried, mostly because he had helped me bury them. The Iron Queen is submerged, but the hull is intact. I waited, the dial-up connection wheezing like a dying animal, until a reply flashed on the screen. Coordinates confirmed. Standing by for extraction, I felt a cold surge of relief. Marcus didn't ask how I was alive. He was a man of protocols, not platitudes. I typed back, negative. I stay dead. I need eyes on the vault. Watch Sienna. Watch Julian. Report every transaction, every board meeting, and every change in the security architecture via this channel alone. Numbers don't lie, but people do, and I knew Marcus would find the trail. As I sat there, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes, I began to see the shape of the betrayal. Marcus confirmed what I had suspected. Sienna had moved with predatory speed. Within 48 hours of my disappearance, she had filed the key person insurance claim and initiated a temporary takeover, citing Julian's emotional distress as the reason for her sudden hand on the wheel. She was playing the grieving daughter-in-law for the cameras, while her lawyers dismantled my life's work behind closed doors. I established the routine then, a clinical cycle of surveillance from the edge of the world. Every morning at the inn, I would log on to receive Marcus's briefings. I watched from the shadows as Sienna began to purge my loyalists, replacing them with consultants whose resumes were as thin as their morals. I saw the company credit cards lighting up at luxury boutiques and high-end real estate offices. They were already spending the blood money. I let them. Every dollar they took was another nail I would use to hammer their coffin shut. I was building a digital dossier, a forensic map of their greed that would eventually leave them with nowhere to hide. I was a digital ghost, watching my son toast to a vacancy while I prepared to fill it with a vengeance they never saw coming. Returning to the mansion on Edgemont Drive felt like breaking into a museum of my own failures. I wore a nondescript coat and a silk scarf pulled tight against the coastal wind, my posture slumped to hide the Iron Queen's unmistakable silhouette. The house stood behind its white columns, cold and imposing, a display case designed to let the world look in while keeping the truth locked away. I approached the side entrance, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. As I suspected, the digital keypad flickered red. Sienna had been thorough, wiping my biometrics and codes before the salt had even dried on my skin. But Sienna was a creature of the digital age, a woman who trusted in encryption and cloud storage. She didn't understand the value of the tangible. I I reached behind a loose stone in the low garden wall, my fingers brushing against the cold, jagged edge of a mechanical key I'd hidden there a decade ago for an emergency I never thought would arrive. The lock turned with a heavy, satisfying thud, the sound of steel meeting steel. I slipped inside, the marble floors amplifying my footsteps in a way that made me feel like an intruder in my own history. The air inside smelled of expensive lilies and the sterile chill of a house that was staged rather than lived in. I moved through the shadows of the grand hallway, avoiding the floor-to-ceiling windows that had once been my pride. The house was too quiet, the silence a heavy shroud that covered the rooms I was no longer supposed to enter. I made my way toward the study, my sanctuary, where the real work of Vance Steele had always been done. I wasn't here for sentiment. I was here for the paper trail. I knew Julian, and now Sienna, believed that anything not on a server didn't exist. They were wrong. I went straight to the built-in mahogany desk, pressing a release lever hidden beneath the molding. A shallow drawer slid out, containing a physical ledger and a stack of courier receipts I'd kept as a final insurance policy. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning for the inconsistencies that had become my specialty as a forensic accountant. I needed to see what they had moved, what they had forged, and who they had paid to make me disappear. Sure enough, Sienna left them the first place I looked, the top right drawer in my study. She had already taken over and erased any memory of me. As I was returning the documents after photographing them, the distant hum of a garage door opener vibrated through the floor. The owners were home. The distant hum of the garage door vibrating through the floorboards was the first note of my death knell. I didn't panic. The Iron Queen doesn't panic. I moved with the clinical precision of a shadow, slipping into the recessed mahogany closet of the nursery, a room that had remained a hollow, decorative museum piece since Julian was a boy. I pulled the door nearly shut, leaving only a sliver of darkness to peer through. My breath held until my lungs burned with the effort. The front door heavy thudded open, followed by the rhythmic click of Sienna's heels on the marble. Then, a sound that shattered the sterile silence of the mansion, the thin, high-pitched wail of a hungry infant. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Sienna had never been pregnant. She was a woman who viewed a child as an inefficient disruption to a corporate takeover. "Keep it quiet, Julian. I can't think over that noise." Sienna's voice snapped, cold and sharp as a glass shard. "He's hungry, Sienna. He's a human being, not a business problem." Julian replied, his voice sounding thinner and more broken than I had ever heard it. I watched through the gap as they entered the room. Julian was cradling a small bundle, his movements tentative and exhausted, while Sienna stood by the window, silhouetted against the midday sun like a predatory bird. "He is a liability," she countered, turning to face him. "The only reason you're still in that CEO chair is because the board believes you're the grieving, stable heir. If the press finds out about your little indiscretion, that you've been hiding a child with another woman while we played the perfect power couple, the Vance Steele stock won't just dip, it will incinerate." Julian flinched as if she'd struck him. "I did what you asked. I stayed silent. I let you handle my mother. How much more do you want?" Sienna stepped closer, her expression 30% mockery and 70% pure steel. "I want you to sign the reassignment of the insurance payout to my personal holding company by tonight. You are my co-conspirator now, Julian. You play your part as the morning sun, or I'll ensure the world knows exactly what kind of saint you really are. I will ruin you, and I will take that child away before you can even say his name." Julian's silence was the answer. As they turned to leave the room, the infant's cries subsided into a soft, haunting whimper. I stayed in the darkness, my fingers gripping the folder of stolen documents until the edges crumpled. Sienna hadn't just pushed me off a boat. She had turned my own son into a prisoner in a cage built of his own mistakes. The Iron Queen was no longer just a ghost. I was a witness to a war, and I finally knew where to strike. The morning mist was still clinging to the cove when Billy pulled a rusted truck up to the front of the inn. I climbed into the passenger seat, clutching my phone like a detonator. Inside its memory were the digital ghosts of my own destruction, the forged insurance policies, and the birth certificate of a child Julian had hidden from the world. But I knew the digital world was too easy to erase. I needed the weight of physical evidence to anchor my revenge. Billy didn't ask questions. He just steered us toward a small, dimly lit photo studio on the edge of town, a place where time seemed to have stopped alongside my heartbeat. The studio smelled of fixer and old paper, a chemical scent that felt more real than the lilies in my stolen mansion. The proprietor, a man with magnifying loops around his neck, took my device with a practiced indifference that I found comforting. I stood by the counter, my pulse a rhythmic hammer in my ears, as the machine began to hum. Slowly, the images began to emerge from the printer. Seeing them in the light, black ink on white paper stripped away the last of my denial. The loops on the signature lines were wrong, the pressure too even, the angle slightly off. They were the same clumsy forgeries I had once seen in a different life. I laid the prints out on the counter. There was the $50 million key person policy, a document that priced my life at the cost of a few corporate jets. And beside it, the birth certificate. The name on the paper wasn't Vance. It was a ghost from Julian's secret life, a vulnerability that Sienna had weaponized to turn my son into a co-conspirator. The evidence was now physical and undeniable. It wasn't just data on a screen anymore. It was a weapon I could hold in my hands. Billy stood behind me, his eyes glancing at the photos before quickly looking away. "It's a lot of money to kill for," he whispered. I gathered the warm, glossy sheets into a folder, my movements precise and clinical. "It's not just about the money, Billy," I replied, my voice as cold as the steel beams that had built my skyline. "It's about the legacy." I looked at the images one last time before tucking them away. The Iron Queen was no longer just watching from the shadows. I had the proof of their treason, and I was ready to bring the entire display case crashing down around them. The drive back to the inn was silent, but in my head the ticking clock had finally begun to accelerate. I waited until the house settled into its final, treacherous silence. The Edgemont mansion was built for echoes, and from my position in the high-backed wing chair in the corner of the study, I heard every movement of their celebration. The popping of a vintage cork, the clinking of baccarat crystal, and the low, self-congratulatory murmur of voices that had already spent my life insurance 50 times over. I sat in total darkness, a shadow among shadows, clutching the folder from the photo studio like a coiled viper. The Iron Queen was no longer treading water. I was the deep, and I was waiting for them to drift into my reach. When the heavy mahogany doors finally swung open, the light from the hallway spilled across the Persian rug like a golden intrusion. Sienna entered first, her red jumpsuit a vivid stain against the cold marble, followed by Julian, who looked like a man walking toward a gallows he had built himself. They were laughing, a brittle and hollow sound, until I reached out and clicked on the desk lamp. The sudden bloom of light caught them like deer in a high-beam glare. Sienna's glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the hardwood, while Julian's face went the color of ash. "The codes have been changed," I said, my voice cutting through the silence with the clinical precision of a scalpel. "But you forgot that I am the one who designed the security for this house. I built the vault, and I know exactly where the override is hidden." I didn't stand. I didn't need to. I simply laid the developed photos of the forged signatures and the secret birth certificate on the desk, fanned out like a winning hand of poker. Sienna's mouth opened, but no sound came out, just a shallow, gasping breath of a cornered predator. Julian's knees buckled, and he collapsed into the guest chair, his head in his hands. "Mom," he choked out, the word sounding like a foreign language. I looked at him, not with the warmth of a mother, but with the cold assessment of a CEO looking at a failed asset. "I've been a ghost for 14 days, I continued, sliding my laptop toward them. The screen displayed a live connection to Marcus, my confidant, who was at that very moment sitting in a federal office. "The digital files are already with the FBI. The wire transfers, the forged insurance policies, and the recorded ultimatum you gave my son in the nursery. It's over, Sienna. You thought you were inheriting an empire, but all you've inherited is a 35-year sentence." Outside, the rhythmic blue and red of police lights began to paint the floor-to-ceiling windows, signaling that the Iron Queen's court was finally back in session. The sirens faded into a dull, rhythmic pulse as the flashing lights were replaced by the gray, honest light of a new morning. Edgemont Drive was quiet again, but the mansion felt different, hollowed out, as if the arrest of its new masters had finally let the house breathe. I stood on the terrace, watching the sun climb over the Atlantic, the same water that had tried to swallow me 14 days ago. The Vance group was gone, the board voting to liquidate rather than face the fallout of Sienna's conspiracy and my son's silence. The headlines were brutal, calling it the fall of the Vance Steele dynasty, but for the first time in 30 years, the weight of the crown didn't feel like iron. Julian was gone too, facing a deferred sentence and a long, difficult road to rehabilitation through the testimony I provided against Sienna. He had chosen the secret child over the company, and in a way, it was the first strong decision he'd ever made. I didn't stay to watch the auctioneers tag the furniture. I sold the mansion and the fleet, donating the hunting lodge to a trust and the yacht to a marine research foundation. My life had been a series of cold, calculated mergers, but the only inheritance worth keeping wasn't the steal. I took the Mercer name, my mother's name, and left the Vance legacy at the bottom of the ocean where Sienna thought she'd left me. I work as a consultant now, helping those whose lives were dismantled by corporate greed, much like the way I dismantled my own past. I sleep better in a modest apartment that doesn't amplify my footsteps. Every so often, I get a letter from Julian, not about stock options or power plays, but about the boy. We are building honest lives from the wreckage, and for a woman who lived in a golden cage, there is no greater victory than the silence of a house that is finally a home.